Well, hello there, y'all. Let's talk today about something different. Let's talk about Thanos and the Avengers. If you're not familiar, if you've been living under a rock, the Avengers movies, especially, were the sort of the culmination of the Marvel Cinematic Universe back in the 2010s. And Thanos was the big bad guy, the big baddie. And I've always been a fan of the Avengers. I've read them since I was a kid. I remember reading the stories about Thanos. I read about Captain America. I read stories of Thor. I read stories of Iron Man, Spider-Man, all those characters. I was more of a DC guy, but I certainly read all the Marvel stuff. And when the movies came out, yeah, some were better than others, certainly, but generally speaking, they were pretty darn good. Up until the last movie of the Avengers called Endgame. And there's something that's been on my mind for quite some time about Endgame. It disturbs me in a lot of ways. It's not a very good movie, and it was really disappointing. I was so thrilled at the end of the second to last, the penultimate movie called Infinity War. And when Endgame came out, it was a real letdown for me. And after that, we had a cascade of movies, one after the other, that were just kind of lousy, just lousy. Now, before Endgame, of course, there was a sort of lousy Captain Marvel movie and a few other duds, stinkers, if you will. But Endgame really, it was bad. It was really bad. And it was sort of like, you're building up to this? This is what you're building up to? So it's disturbed me for some time, a lot of things about Endgame. And I've rewritten the story, gosh, so many times, both in my head and then some on paper and blog. But one thing in particular has really disturbed me about the character of Thanos. And I want to talk about that today. Now, before you write all this off as sort of a geek going geek on you, I've always been a firm advocate that the images and stories that we tell really not only reflect our society, but they also shape our society. That as human beings, we live by images. And Hollywood at its best has been a force for telling really good stories and framing a vision of the world. And it can point out problems and difficulties. It can embody worries and fears. It can prophesy about things that could happen or might happen. That's at its best. Now, at its worst, it's a shill. It's a money-grubbing institution. It pumps out a lot of cheap bilge. It's true. But at its absolute worst, it can operate sometimes as a massage parlor for character of people. If character massaging the images of people when their image goes bad. And at its absolute worst, Hollywood is a character massage parlor for gangsters and thugs and politicians and murderers and all other sorts of ne'er-do-wells. So keep that in mind, because the images that we have now in our society are primarily coming from places like video games and movies and music. They aren't coming so much from books anymore. People don't read as much as they ought to or as much as they used to. And we certainly don't have attendance to the cinema, the plays. We have attendance to the cinema instead. Cinema is our cultural voice. And so not only does cinema frame how we view the world, it also reflects how we view the world. So that being said, what happened with Thanos? What was the deal with Thanos? Well, I tend to think that Thanos was one of the greatest villain characters in cinema probably ever created. Yeah, he was a cartoon character. I get it. So, get over that. But as a villain, you always have to have a villain that's sympathetic. And you have to have a villain that has a very good motive for doing what he's doing, or she. And if the villain has those things, if they're sympathetic and they have a very good motive for what they're doing, they're far more sinister. They're far more dangerous, far more lethal. Why? Because they're much more identifiable. We can identify with them more. We think, oh, that could be me. And they're much more realistic because humans are never simple. We're always a complex uh, coordinates of all sorts of different things that are motivating us. So the worst thing you can do is create a villain who is cardboard. He's flat. He's weak. That's the sort of muhahaha villain. I'm gonna take over the universe. Like the little bug out of SpongeBob SquarePants, right? You can take over the world.
All knees will bow to Plankton.
Or you have a villain who simply wants to rob things and get rich. Okay, that's a very cardboard reason, very base reason. So either they have an unrealistic reason of power, or they have an unrealistic vision of just wanting to get rich. That's very cardboard villain stuff.
First, I will unleash my giant penguins at the fair today, so they may begin freezing the entire city. Then I will sell all the citizens of Danville my organic yet highly addictive Doof brand hot chocolate.
But when you have a villain who has very complex motivations, or is testing something, some theory about humanity, or is convinced in a sort of zealous way about the rightness of their cause, you get a really stunning, terrifying villain, one that we can identify with, one that is very effective and hard to beat, because that sort of villain is not just identifiable, he's identified with. In other words, a villain who just wants to take over the world, or just wants to rob a bank, people aren't going to be like, yeah, I want to rob a bank too, and millions of people follow behind him to rob every bank. It just doesn't happen. And you have a villain who's like, I'm going to take over the world. Other people are going to join on and say, oh, I'm part of that train. I want to be part of the taking over the world crew. They just don't hop on board. But if you have a villain who has a very good motive, some sort of personal calamity, well, other people might say, well, I've had personal calamity too. I sympathize with what he's doing.
Arthur, I have some bad news for you. This is the last time we'll be meeting.
You don't listen, do you? You just ask the same questions every week. How's your job? Are you having any negative thoughts? All I have are negative thoughts.
Therefore, I forgive him, or I side with him, or I'll let him do his stuff. It makes sense. Or even worse, you have somebody who has a really zealous vision that he wants to put into place. And other people say, yes, that's a good vision. I want to follow that. I want to join on. Sign me up for Hydra. Hail Hydra. But that kind of thing is extremely dangerous because it actually happens in the real world. We see characters in history, the Joseph Stalins, the Adolf Hitlers, the Pol Pots. That guy or woman, but normally seems to be a guy, strangely enough, but that person has a vision that other people say, oh, that's a great vision. You're absolutely right. We need to do this. Let's do this. And whatever the do this is, it costs the lives of thousands or millions of people. That's really dangerous. So what was Thanos' motivation? Well, if you go back to the original movies that led up to Infinity War, and I forget where it is that this occurs. It may be in one of the Captain Americas, and maybe in Civil War. I don't know where exactly this happens. Maybe it's in Infinity War. But at one point, Thanos tells us that the reason that he is doing what he's doing is not just to take over the universe. He says, I'm going to wipe out 50% of the universe, or something like that. It's a large number of the universe. The population of the entire universe. Why is he going to do that? He says, well, I'm going to do it because the universe cannot sustain that amount of burgeoning life.
Your home?
It was. And it was beautiful.
Titan was like most planets. Too many mouths, not enough to go around. And when we faced extinction, I offered a solution.
Genocide.
But random, dispassionate, fair to rich and poor alike. They called me a madman. And what I predicted came to pass.
Congratulations, you're a prophet
I'm a survivor.
who wants to murder trillions.
With all 6 stones, I could simply snap my fingers. They would all cease to exist. I call that mercy.
And then what?
I finally rest and watch the sunrise on a grateful universe. The hardest choices require the strongest wills.
The universe will collapse. Our resources are limited. Our space is limited. And as long as we have growing numbers of sentient beings everywhere, we're going to have increased warfare. We're going to have increased famine. We're going to have increased disease and death. So to prevent that, to protect the very beings I'm going to kill, I have to kill them. At first, that might seem utterly insane. But then you start thinking about what is actually being said. Because again, symbols, stories, are not always about interstellar beings. They're not always about animals. They're not always about superheroes. More frequently, they're actually about regular humans, right here on this planet, doing what we do. And so that philosophy that Thanos puts forth is actually a philosophy that's talking about not the universe, but this planet. That philosophy is a philosophy spoken through the mouth of this alien purple being, played by Josh Brolin. Very well, by the way. I loved Josh Brolin's depiction. It's a sentiment which may or may not, but high probability that it is, could come from the mouth of a human being on this planet. The idea that this planet is under strain. Humans are too populous on this planet. There are too many of us. We're using up our resources. This sort of like idea of the population bomb that came out in the 60s and 70s, influential book that said that there are too many humans. And by the time, I think it was 1980 that this author prophesied this would happen. By 1980, we'll have exhausted the resources of the planet and everybody will die, suffer, and then die. It'll be horrible. It is possible, in fact, it is probable that there are some people who really believe this. If you don't think they do, then, well, good morning. They do exist, people that think this. They think that there are too many humans. Therefore, the best thing to do is to kill off a few. That's the philosophy. Kill them off. How? Well, by war, by disease, by famine, and just by outright killing them. Those are the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse, after all, right? War, famine, pestilence, and death. Those haven't changed since biblical times. War, famine, pestilence, and death are still the 4 best ways to kill off the human population in large droves. An asteroid, perhaps, but that's not our doing. So if, for instance, you are someone who holds the idea that there are too many humans on this earth, and you're serious about it, you put into practice either war or famine or pestilence or outright death, killing people in massive amounts. Auschwitz, right? Dachau, right? Treblinka, right? The killing fields of Cambodia, abortion, right? Euthanasia, all that stuff. Now, it's not utterly outrageous that there might indeed be people that think this way on this planet. And if they're your garden variety crank, the old fella next door who yells at clouds, if that's all they are, then they're kind of harmless, unless, you get on their bad side. But if, for instance, hypothetically, they are powerful people with a lot of wealth and a lot of influence, they might have this glorious vision, this beautiful vision of vast vistas in the future where we will achieve the glorious morning of next Tuesday, the great era where we will share everything in communion with one another. They might have this vision of technology being used to our benefit so that all mankind is able to enjoy technology and live luxuriously. We just have to do one thing. We have to diminish the population and control it afterwards. Now, I'm not saying that there are people like that, but there are people like that. They exist. They have stated outright that they think this way. So then ask this question. How did such a philosophy get into the mouth of a Marvel character in a movie? How did that happen? How did the writers who created this movie conceive of this? And then not only conceive it, but put it into a script that got passed by censors. And then not only got passed by censors, but then was put into practice in the auditioning and the filming of, and the production of, and then the dissemination of a character in a movie who professes exactly this thing. Isn't that strange? I mean, not Doctor Strange, but strange. If, for instance, I am a powerful person who has wealth and owns a lot of companies and maybe owns Hollywood institutions or owns people in Hollywood, wouldn't I try to not get that released? Wouldn't I try to divert that or make it so cartoonish that nobody believed it anymore? Like, imagine believing that. What kind of crank would believe that? Frequently Hollywood is used to manipulate minds. It's used to manipulate a populace so that we don't end up thinking what we should think. We think badly about something. We don't think straight about something. And frequently, Hollywood, the images that come out of Hollywood are used in order to divert us from an accurate assessment of things. So how did a character like Thanos come into being? He's one of the greatest villains I think ever created. I'll say that again. How did he come into being? I really don't know. But if he did come into being, and he was so terrifying in Infinity War in 2018, why then did he die like such a pussy in 2019's Endgame? And not only once, but twice in that movie. Why? That's peculiar, isn't it? Why, for instance, did Endgame, and which was a mess anyway, because it had all sorts of different stories that didn't go anywhere, that didn't really follow up. It betrayed all the tragedy that occurred in Infinity War. It made a sacrifice out of Iron Man when really he's not the one that should have been sacrificed. It didn't really show heroism. It was already moving into that whole realm of the MCU, as Nerdrotic calls it. It had all this flaws, but it had this major flaw of a real betrayal of the character of Thanos. So in the story of Infinity War, if you are unfamiliar, Thanos decides to destroy a huge portion of the universe, 50% or whatever it is. And he does so by this snap of a finger and just powders people. There's no stopping him. He just turns them into complete dust.
You should have gone for the head. What did you do? What did you do?
Where'd he go? For? Where'd he go?
Steve? Major characters, right? Spider-Man, Hawkeye, they're just snuffed. And it's tragic. It is an amazing movie and ends on this utter cliffhanger. So I was on the edge of my seat. I really was so anticipating what was going to go next, what was going to happen next. And what happens next, spoiler alert, not only does every character snuffed out by the snap come back, but Thanos is dispatched earlier in the movie, within the first half hour to 45 minutes. He's killed, decapitated by one of the characters. Thor, I think, maybe kills him. And we see him at the very beginning of the movie as sad and penitent and run down and not threatening at all. Just really, really sad of what he had to do. And it's such a switch of character. It's really quite stunning. They reverse the character because the Thanos from Infinity War is terrifying. But there's a nobility to him. And he respects certain characters that he knows he has to kill. And there's a strain of love in him because when he kills his daughter, Gamora, he's deeply grieved by this. I mean, it's really a poignant scene. It's not like, oh, you're so evil and sinister because you killed Gamora. It's like, I really feel tragedy for this guy who's so driven by the conviction that he has to fix the universe, that he ends up sacrificing the only child that he ever really loved. Terribly sad.
Daughter?
Did you do it?
Yes.
What did it cost?
Everything.
That's not anywhere in Endgame. Not only because there are two Thanoses, right? The first Thanos is killed very early in the movie, and he's penitent about what he had to do. He's sad, but it's not noble. There's no nobility to him. He's a very one-dimensional character, and then he's killed. So everything's tied up in a nice, neat ball and all this, right? But no, not yet, because there's a second Thanos. How does that happen? Well, it's movie mumbo jumbo. It's never mind. A second Thanos, basically from a time warp that occurs, discovers that he has an opportunity to do what? To take over the universe. I mean, it's almost ludicrous because the second Thanos has cardboard, one-dimensional base motives. He's not rich in motive. He's not a sinister character. He's a guy who wants to take over the universe. That's it. And at the end of the movie, he's destroyed. How? A bunch of women mob him. All the female characters mob Thanos. Well, they come back from this warp that's been created by movie bullshit. And they come back into the world and they fight Thanos and they distract him long enough. Iron Man gets the glove and he snaps it again. And everybody, all the other dead people come back and he reverses everything. And then he dies because the snap is so big that it destroys Iron Man. And I'm sorry if I spoiled the movie for you. But here's the point. The second Thanos in Endgame, well, neither Thanos in Endgame is the same as the Thanos in Infinity War. And the first Thanos dies like a loser. He dies like Boba Fett. He dies like a pussy. He just has his head cut off after sniveling for a while, and that's it. The second Thanos gets mobbed by women and destroyed. Killed, I think. And then everything's reversed and everybody goes home happy. And so, yay. And neither Thanos in Endgame is at all believable. It's not really sympathetic at all. It's quite the betrayal of a very, very powerful character that they created in Infinity War. Now, my question again is why? Not only why did the great character of Thanos ever get allowed to come into being, but why then was it completely scrapped, that character in Endgame? Now, one has to acknowledge that it could be complete corporate muck up, that the corporate didn't want to kill the character because he was so good for marketing and merchandise. And they just meddled too much and destroyed the movie. I mean, it's happened elsewhere. Justice League, for instance, being a great example. That's possible. It could be that the writers who always work as teams there in Hollywood, it's never a solo writer. The writers were just poorer quality. It's possible. And that poorer quality showed up less than a year after Infinity War. That's possible, but not probable. For instance, why would corporate be more involved in Endgame than Infinity War? That makes no sense. Both have the same gloss, the same production value. They both have the same amount of involvement of corporation in them. By the time Infinity War came around, all these characters, Captain America, Captain Marvel, Spider-Man, Iron Man, Black Panther, these were money-making characters. And Infinity War, they had a lot riding on it that corporations would have been involved and said, do this, don't do that. Don't jeopardize our brand. Don't risk our product, or whatever it was. So how were they more involved in Endgame than Infinity War? It could be they were bad writers, it's true. But it seems very strange because 2019 is not a long way from 2018. And if the writers for Infinity War were as top-notch as they were, what happened to them all in less than a year? Because production, of course, for Endgame was already going by the time Infinity War was released. What happened to them all? Were the old writers fired and a whole new bunch of writers brought in? I mean, certainly we see later on that those same writers go on to destroy all sorts of franchises, Star Wars and Star Trek and Daredevil and one after the Doctor Who, one after the other. The same group of writers or type of writers end up destroying franchise after franchise after franchise. It's true. And we had in the 2020 onwards just 5 years of just complete awfulness and bilge being pumped out. Here's a speculation. Take it with a grain of salt, do with it what you will. But remember I said earlier that sometimes movies tell us how to think about the world, and sometimes they reflect what we think about the world, and sometimes they embody dangers or prophesy dangers that we don't yet see. Is it possible that Thanos cut too close to the bone, that he was too much of an embodiment of a certain ideology, that he revealed too much of a plan that was about to happen, driven by powers of wealth who harbor an ideology? Is it possible that Thanos, the character, was in some ways a prophecy for some later pandemic that was going to hit and a vaccine subsequent to that pandemic, both of which were going to cause massive death and massive incarceration and massive lockdown and massive change in society, with a hope of a whole new world evolving from that, a new world order evolving from that, with the hope that people would put their trust more in government and technology and submit more to what certain powers wanted them to submit to. Is it possible that that cut too close to the bone? And certain powers that be said, you have to massage this image. You have to change this image and make it so that people remember Thanos not as a plausible, terrifying possibility that is very real, but remember him rather as a weeping, blubbering loser or a one dimensional character. Is that possible? Is it possible that Endgame is what we call a psyop? Something that was designed, I don't know whether by the director or by the writers, but by somebody, designed intentionally to disrupt the way of thinking about the Thanoses, the death bringers in the real world, that maybe they weren't the architects behind the massive disruption and carnage that occurred in the next 6 years after 2018. Is that possible? I don't know. I'm just throwing it out there. Let me know what you think. And much thanks to the people that inspired this. Everybody from the writers and directors and actors in Infinity War to my own brother, Benjamin, and to the excellent commentators that I follow on a regular basis. Gary from Nerdrotic and Razor Fist and Critical Drinker and Garrett and Ryan and all the rest of the chaps that have such a good time ripping Hollywood a new one. Keep it up, everybody. The darkness, as Tolkien says, the darkness, it can't last forever.
Make a hole in the middle. Hey, make a hole in the middle. Make a hole in the middle. Clear it out. Make a hole in the middle. Hey, make a hole in the middle. Make a hole in the middle. Clear it out. Make a hole in the middle. Hey, make a hole in the middle. Make a hole in the middle. Clear it out. Make a hole in the middle. Hey, make a hole in the middle. Make a hole in the middle. Clear it out. Make a hole in the middle. Hey, make a hole in the middle. Make a hole in the middle. Clear it out.
Did you do it? What did it cost?